So-called hate groups multiplied across the country over the last year, and the Trans-Pacific Partnership developed into the world's largest trade pact. The largest media outlets in the country pretty much ignored those stories, while stories of Miley Cyrus twerking filled the airwaves. Over 2013, many significant stories occurred around the world, but were simply not reported on nationally. With so much going on in the world, it's impossible to report on everything, but many stories that have a significant effect on many people have largely been buried by the press. That's where Project Censored comes in. Every year they produce a top 25 list of the most underreported stories. Walter Cronkite said, "Project Censored is one of the organizations that we should listen to in order to check on the ethics of other news sources." Their director is Mickey Huff, and he joins us now via Skype from San Francisco. He's a professor of social science and history at the Diablo Valley College. Huff is our guest today, and he's here to give you the list of the most underreported stories of 2013 and how those stories affect you and your family. Welcome to the program, Mickey.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate the opportunity.
Mickey, before we get into the top underreported stories, is the lack of reporting due to time and space constraints, budgetary constraints, or are these stories not reported because of seedy political influence?
Well, you know, the old argument that one would oft get, and our founder Carl Jensen experienced this. Project Censored was started in 1976, and when he was first confronting journalists about the things they do or do not cover, one of the reactions, that was very common among journalists, editors, and so on was, well, there's only so much time and there's only so much space. There's only so many column inches. So we have to make decisions. We have to make decisions based on news judgment or what we find is most significant and important. And so he thought that was an interesting response. So he started to pay more attention to what the corporate news media did cover. And what he came up with was junk food news, meaning that for an institution like the so-called free press to be talking about news judgment and then to be showing absolutely inane and ridiculous stories. And
let me jump back for the benefit of our viewers. Define corporate media.
Sure. Corporate media is it's the media that's owned. They lease the airwaves through the government. So the airwaves were allegedly belonging to the public, according to the 1934 Telecommunications Act, but they are leased out to major broadcasters, and they are mostly owned by major corporations. And in the United States, 90% of the media that people consume is basically controlled by 6 corporations. Now, I know people are accustomed to the term mainstream media, but there's really nothing mainstream about the kind of reporting that you see in corporate media: ABC, CBS, NBC, CNN, Fox, MSNBC. And then the so-called public media in the United States, NPR, PBS, they get a lot of their money from corporations. Public media tend to call it underwriting. In corporate media, it's advertising. That's where they get most of their money. But by the way, that's also then back to what Jenkins and then the second director of Project Censored, Peter Phillips, said, was that there's a lot of news abuse or propaganda. So for organizations to come and say that somehow Project Censored was attacking them, what we discovered over the years was we were actually critiquing them, and particularly on the top stories that we researched, we felt and we thought we could argue and prove with evidence that these institutions were simply failing the public. They were failing to report these stories because of ownership issues: who owned the particular media outlet, what the relationships were, who sits on a board of directors at company X that also sits on a company's board of directors over at company Y, advertiser dollars, influence, right? Fear or favor in the newsroom, as Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting like to say. What influences the way stories are reported? And in 1988, Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman published a book called Manufacturing Consent on the political economy of mass media, and it went over what they called the propaganda model, and they outlined 5 specific things that significantly can influence the way news is broadcast: ownership, advertising, sourcing, only relying on official sources, flack or feedback, and the last was ideology. And of course, running up through the 80s and early 90s, the prevailing ideology in the United States was anti-communist. And if you go after 9/11, it's anti-terrorist, whatever that means exactly. But we found overall that there are a lot of reasons that these stories are underreported or not reported at all, and we try to give those stories more life, more legs, if you will, because we believe the public has a right to hear these important stories.
So what would you say is a common thread to all of the underreported stories this year?
Well, the stories in the top 25 are often diverse topically, but they generally deal with making more transparent the power structures in our society, who calls the shots. So most of the stories that we really look at are factual-based stories that are published in small alternative or independent news media somewhere, right? So that's important to note when we talk about censorship. The traditional definitions of censorship are sort of governmental censorship, where the story is never told or the information is made classified. But censorship exists in far more insidious guises in the United States. It exists in various forms of biases, framing, slighting of content. Scholar Michael Parenti has gone down a long list of these types of things: false balancing, false equivalency, objectivity bias. There's a whole host of things that we get into when we analyze our stories that start to look at how things aren't covered, and we analyze then why in our censored news clusters. But the thread really is, again, unmasking power, showing how decisions are made, where and why, how they affect the public, and how most decisions that are made seem to really to benefit the plutocracy or the so-called 1% in the United States rather than the bulk of the population. We have a whole series. I'm sorry.
So what role do independent networks play in reporting stories that others refuse to carry?
Well, these organizations and institutions, of which there are many, Pacifica, for example, we have a weekly radio show there where we get out these kinds of stories on more of a real-time basis than the book that we do every year. But independent media, I mean, it's really the life's blood of democracy. There's almost no other way to put it. Democratic republics really depend on having an informed electorate and an informed citizenry. And if the corporate media is beholden to their owners and their advertisers and their shareholders, they have a certain interest afoot. More independent and alternative media outlets may have biases. We're not suggesting that there aren't biases. There's really no such thing as true objectivity. What we're saying, though, is that they practice a form of journalism that is transparently sourced. If there is a bias, one knows about it when they're going there, so they can maybe go to the Nation or something like that and know they're getting a progressive left view, and then they can go to the National Review and get a different story that's more from, the right, or something that's more akin to a Republican Party platform.
Now, shifting over to Dianne Feinstein for a moment, I want to get your organization's take, Project Censor's take, on her decision to try to limit or define journalism. What are your thoughts on that?
I'm glad you asked. I live in California. Project Censor is based in California. We have a long history of looking at Dianne Feinstein and her husband's business dealings and her politics here. And lately, that was one of the big themes in the censored 2014 book, Fearless Speech in Fateful Times. Several of the top stories were about the war on whistleblowers, the war on journalists around the world and here in the United States. We talk a lot about Thomas Drake, Chelsea Manning, etc. Basically, what came out of this and what came out of the Edward Snowden debacle at the NSA and the surveillance and the spying and so forth, and the attacks on Glenn Greenwald, is he a real journalist? I mean, nothing could be more absurd of a question. Actually, anybody that asks that question, we might want to ask, are they a real journalist? Well, Dianne Feinstein, in something called the Free Flow of Information Act, is helping to propose that we define who journalists are by their degree, by their employment, not by what journalists do.
Well, isn't the restriction of journalists as a whole in that bill completely opposite of the title of the bill, the
Absolutely.
free flow of information?
It's just like No Child Left Behind, where there are many left behind, or Clear Sky Initiatives, where it allowed corporations to pollute more. It's another one of these Orwellian doublespeak kind of tricks. The USA Patriot Act, if you look at the contents of it, hardly something that civil libertarians would consider patriotic in any way. Free Flow of Information Act does exactly the opposite. It gives a free flow of information and a free pass to corporate media and credentialed journalists, while it leaves citizen journalists and independent journalists and many other people in the lurch. One would even want a guess like what Project Censored, would that be considered journalistic? I mean, that's our mission statement, is to support independent journalism and have a vibrant free press. But Dianne Feinstein and many of the powers that be in the plutocracy would rather really truncate. They would rather winnow and limit who could be a journalist rather than actually protect the act of journalism, which is most crucial. And by the way, the U.S. Constitution already protects the act of journalism in the First Amendment by saying that we can't have any interference in a truly free press. So, yeah, these efforts by people like Feinstein and others, I know there are efforts to try to change some of the wording in the bill, but the very fact that they are going about this is what's most troublesome.
Now, you mentioned Edward Snowden. What might have happened if he'd released the documents to smaller media outlets rather than large media corporations? Would the information have simply been swept under the rug?
It could have been. And we did see efforts of people like Manning and others who really tried to take their case, like Dan Ellsberg did with the Pentagon Papers. And back then, one crucial difference was that the major media outlets like the New York Times took the case very seriously. And it ended up at the Supreme Court, and Nixon lost. They, of course, retaliated against Ellsberg and tried to do anything they could to damage him or his credibility. That's the shoot the messenger game. That's writ large right now. The Obama administration has persecuted and attempted to prosecute more whistleblowers than any president in history combined in the United States. That is a very significant effort. We write about that in our new book, and Brian Covert writes about that extensively. Many other countries around the world, by the way, are emulating that. Japan just passed a law doing something similar, as we're trying to do here with the Free Flow of Information Act. So I don't know for sure. I know that they certainly get out, and I know going to the Guardian in London and Glenn Greenwald, that was certainly something Snowden was able to do. Manning did try to give the documents, including collateral murder, showing American soldiers killing innocent civilians and journalists in Iraq. Just incredible crimes being committed. And it's Manning that's staring down 35 years for making the documents known through WikiLeaks with Julian Assange. And our
Mickey, hold that thought, because we need to take a break. When we return, we're going to count down the list of top underreported stories of 2013, starting with number 15 with the director of Project Censored, Mickey Huff. Stay tuned.